All right, everybody, we've got WBZ's Kristina Rex, our reporter in the courtroom for the Karen Read trial in Dedham. And even though we only had one day of testimony this week, we did want to go back and talk about a part of the case, the trial, Kristina, that we didn't touch on, which was last Friday, the testimony of the ATF agent, Brian Higgins. So thanks for doing this again, first of all, and explain for us who he is.
Okay, so Brian Higgins is an ATF agent, so a federal agent, but he worked out of the town of Canton. He has an office in the Canton Police Department, and he's good friends with Brian Albert, the homeowner at 34 Fairview. He was out with the group that night because he and Brian Albert had been to a fellow police officer's funeral in New York City that day, had driven back together, and had gotten dinner together before meeting the rest of the group out at the Waterfall Bar and Grill. And then Brian Higgins also went back to Brian Albert's house for the after party, but he testified that he was one of the first ones to leave, and his reasoning was that he's a whiskey drinker, and there was only beer at the house, so he knew it wasn't going to be a long night for him, so he was one of the first to leave that after night.
And one of the really, it was pretty intense and dramatic, his reading of his text messages with Karen Read, who he got to know through John O'Keefe.
Yeah, and I think that leading up to Brian Higgins, there was a lot of mystery around this man because he hasn't really put himself in the public sphere. And he is one of those three people who the defense has pointed to as a third-party culprit, so like a potential alternate suspect. So I think a lot of people were waiting to hear from him. Like, who is this guy? What is he like? What is he going to testify to? And what he testifies to is this flirtatious relationship he had with Karen Read in the month leading up to John O'Keefe's death. That included a series of flirty text messages that, according to his testimony and what we all got to hear out loud, were initiated by Karen when she sought out his phone number and texted him. Also a kiss that the two of them shared that he also testified, in his words, Karen planted on him. And a flirtatious texting relationship that really got kind of awkward by the end.
There was kind of an accusation that one of them ghosted the other one, and it just stopped. So
but that was only days before the passing. So January 23rd was the last text between the two of them before that day when this all happened, which is January 28th. So,
and you can imagine what was trying to be drawn out on the stand was, this is a guy who was a former firefighter, then now he's an ATF agent. He seemed rather upset, that it's being insinuated that he might be a murderer. I mean, that is the insinuation, and he was forced to read some of these dramatic text messages. So it got pretty heated between him.
Yeah, and I can't stress this enough. Like, imagine going in front of the public on national television and being forced to read what are clearly embarrassing text messages. I mean, he testified, I'm not proud of these. He had to, because the way evidence works, attorneys can't just give the jury evidence. Exactly. They have to come in through witnesses. So he had to sit there. It was an hour long reading those texts. I mean, it was easily the most awkward hour in that courtroom that we've had. So that was on Friday.
Really, which it's interesting because that might have created a level of sympathy for him. You never know what that's going to conjure up in a juror listening to that kind of emotional testimony.
It's so many of those text messages were him checking with Karen. Like, I can't tell if you're being serious. Like, are you real about this? Almost like he wasn't picking up on clues that she was dropping, but he was saying, John's a nice guy. I thought you were in this happy relationship. I can't tell if you're being real. It was awkward to listen to. It was
awkward. And it was also establishing that Karen and John's relationship was on the rocks.
Exactly. And that was really the first setting that stone, or not the first. The Aruba testimony we talked about last week might have been the first. But this was
accusations of jealousy. Exactly. And now within the flirty text messages, her mentioning having to take care of his kids, which were his niece and nephew, and that really wasn't her deal. She hadn't counted on that. And that was creating tension between them. And so Brian Higgins was totally aware of this. And so this is the defense trying to set him up as somebody who might have a motive if he had a crush on her and knew that relationship might be coming to an end.
Right. But the prosecution, those text messages came in through the prosecution. They're trying to show that, Karen was maybe at the end of her rope in this relationship. And who knows what the jury thinks. But then on cross-examination, I mean, the texts were barely even a part of cross-examination.
Right.
examination became all about Brian Higgins' phone. And that took us into this week, the one day of testimony this week.
Yeah. And the interesting thing I do want to note about the phone, because I think this is what really got people's attention. He deleted text messages, even though, this is a federal agent, so he clearly knows about the custody of evidence and not destroying evidence. But he also took the SIM card out of his phone, and they pointed out, went out of his way to dispose of it on a military base. Why did he say he did that?
So he says that's where he throws out his trash. It's really interesting. So basically, what happened, what he was asked about, what he testified to on direct and cross-examination, is that he contacted a friend who's a fellow federal agent who taught him how to use software they have to extract text messages from your phone. So using, federal investigative software, he says he extracted his text with John and with Karen, and then, in his words, just got rid of his phone or got a new phone. In the defense's words, destroyed his phone. He extracts just those text messages. He takes out his SIM card and he either breaks it or cuts it, he says. And then he gets a new phone number and he throws out his phone in a trash bag and dumps it in a dumpster at a military base, which is where he says he gets rid of his trash anyway. And his reasoning for getting rid of his phone that he testified to is that he was really sensitive about his personal number. And who was a part of an investigation he was doing undercover, had gotten a hold of his personal number and started contacting him that way, which he says put him on edge. So the timing of this is right around the time that the defense attorneys had requested he preserve his phone.
Right. And because a lot of members of the public started to become deeply involved in this case, he didn't want his number to get out.
Exactly.
Someone might put it online.
Right. And so that's really up to what the jury believes, right? Do they think it's really sketchy that he destroyed his phone and threw it out on a military base? Or do they believe his reasoning for why he did it?
Right. And it is fascinating because he is a federal agent. Is there anything about his testimony or what you heard at the beginning of this week that you think we should point out that people might not have noticed? Or how do you think he came across as a witness?
I think that like I said, he was highly anticipated, and that I do think a lot of people were expecting, like, who is this guy?
Right.
We knew there were allegations about maybe some kind of a relationship with Karen Reed. The defense has at times suggested that he could be a murderer.
Yep.
Is he going to be this big, burly, scary man? And it was really interesting. Whenever in testimony he talked about moving to Canton, he talked about how he did that because his sister had just died and he was relocating, and he couldn't even get through a sentence without choking up.
Yeah, he was very sensitive.
Yes. So the fact he was certainly large, he was a big, you believe that he's a federal agent, but he was softer, perhaps, than I think
you expected.
Him might have expected.
Yep. And what hit me was when they were saying, well, why would why would anybody just destroy your phone? And he said, it was kind of a poignant moment. He said, well, I'm divorced and I don't have any children, so I don't have the kind of memories that other people might want to preserve in a phone camera or in a phone. And I thought, ooh, that would definitely hit some jurors. Like, this is a sensitive person. Yeah.
Right. And I think that, I think you quoted it exactly, actually, what he said. That was definitely a brief standout moment because, you do wonder, God, I would never just get rid of my phone. There's so much on there I would want to save. And he was like, well, listen, like, I don't have that. I don't have a family. I don't have a partner. I have those memories that I needed to save on my phone. It was no big deal for me to get rid of it.
And, whether you like it or not, I mean, it's just how the jury is going to interpret body language or the way people speak. His kind of imploring Karen Reed through those text messages about how she really felt about him. As you say, he did look like a big burly officer, but he came across and sounded like someone who might not have been plotting a murder, and was a little more sensitive than one might.
Somebody who lacked game. I mean, it's not an official term. Somebody who lacked game. Yeah. These are openly flirty texts, and he seems to be not picking up on cues at times. Right. There are two other things in his testimony I wanted to point out. One is, we heard about this in Brian Albert's testimony too, so this is on cross-examination, this 22-second phone call between the two of them.
Yes.
Their call records that morning.
Right.
He wasn't as specific as Brian Albert in saying, oh, definitely a butt dial, must have been a butt dial. But he said, I have no memory of having a conversation with Brian Albert. I'm telling you, I did not talk to Brian Albert that morning.
That's interesting.
And the defense attorney he asked the court's permission, can we stand here for 22 seconds to show how long that time is? And the judge actually said no. She said you could do that in closing argument.
She wants to move things along.
She wants to move this along, right. But 22 seconds is enough time for a phone conversation, right? So that's what the defense attorney was trying to point out. And Brian Higgins just saying, I don't remember that conversation. I don't think there was a conversation. Yeah. And the other point is him going to Canton Police. Where he had an office and he had a key card that in his words didn't grant him full access, but did grant him access
to some parts of the building.
And he went to Canton Police immediately after leaving the Alberts house that night, which the defense has pointed out could be perceived as very sketchy. He says after that officer's funeral he had been at the day before, he had a number of cars, personal and professional, that he kept at Canton Police. And because the snowstorm was coming, he needed to move those cars around for the plow to get through. He had left a key on his desk thinking he was going to be away longer for somebody else to move them. But instead, he says he showed up that night and moved them because he lived all the way in West Roxbury and he didn't want to have to drive there at the crack of dawn to move the car. So he did it then. So that was interesting too.
Yeah. All right, let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some more of the evidence presented in the case and then what we anticipate will be coming next. We'll be right back. All right, we're back with Kristina Rex. And we did want to talk about testimony that no one saw other than people in the courtroom, which is the testimony of the children. Explain why that was blocked by the judge from public view, and then what they talked about.
So they're minors, and these kids are John O'Keefe's niece and nephew. The niece is older than the nephew.
Because his sister had died.
Exactly. His sister passed away from cancer. I believe it was in 2013. Her husband died of a heart attack just a few months later. So these kids were orphaned very quickly. John took them in. We don't want to identify them too much, but they're both teenagers. The niece is older than the nephew, is what I can tell you. So they're minors. That is why court became private during their testimony. And you could feel a shift in the room when you knew they were coming. The members of the O'Keefe family that were in the room all shuffled out and a new group came in, including more kids who I presume are their first cousins, John.
Probably to make them feel more comfortable on the stand.
Exactly. And this is the first time I've seen other kids in the courtroom with the O'Keefe family. So they clearly had a certain group of people they wanted in there as these kids testified. One other thing that was different is that the kids, the jury was excused and the kids were put on the stand one at a time before the jury came in. So rather than having the Commonwealth, call your next witness and then walking in, they were already sitting there to be more comfortable. So I'll talk more about the niece. The nephew's younger and he testified to just remembering a lot of yelling and a lot of fights between John and Karen in the months leading up to his passing. The niece testified much more specifically to what those fights were. So she testified about, and her first quote just about these fights, I was pen and paper, no computers. So I logged all of my notes afterwards. She said, quote, "It was good in the beginning, but it was bad at the end. There was a lot of arguing and fighting and a lot of toxicity, a lot of name calling. It always got really loud." So she talked about that Aruba fight, which was over New Year's Eve, about a month before John died. She says that she wasn't there for the lobby portion of the fight. She didn't testify to that, but she was there in the kids' room. They had a separate hotel room when she says, John came into the room and something developed where he and Karen ended up fighting, with her accusing him of kissing another woman in the hotel lobby. She said screaming, fighting right in front of the kids. That was one she testified to. Then another she testified to was at home back in their kitchen after this Aruba trip. So now we're talking weeks before John's passing. And she said, John was just asking her, Karen, to leave my house. He said the relationship had run its course, that it used to be fun and now it's not. She says Karen said no and was swearing, and that John asked her to leave more than once and she didn't. She stayed all night and John went and locked himself in his room. And she said throughout the month of January, quote, "It was just more episodes pretty much like that."
And it's interesting to note, two of the things that the jury would have heard so far is Karen Reed in her text to Brian Higgins that she never wanted children. This was not what she had planned on. But that also am I right about this? Several weeks ago, there was some accusation that he would criticize her about the things she was spoiling the kids or something.
Yes,
like
she
that.
spoiled the kids too much. Yes.
Yeah. So clearly that the niece and nephew caused a lot of conflict because.
Yes. A lot of the discussion about their fights prior to the niece and nephew testifying were that the fights would be about how they parented the kids.
Right. Which would establish a rocky relationship coming to an end and how Karen Reed would have felt about him at this point.
Right. And whether or not that connects to murder is really
exactly.
Plenty of couples fight.
Of course.
But
especially when kids are involved.
It was definitely poignant to have the kids, it was a moment having the kids on the stand. The courtroom felt very somber. And the thing I noticed about the jurors, who are incredibly attentive and always taking notes, they were not taking notes when the kids were on the stand. They were eyes on the kids the whole time.
They just paid attention.
And it wasn't sensitive in the sense that like people weren't crying when the kids were testifying. Okay. The kids were very, I guess strong is the word. They were just very direct.
Well, they've been through a lot.
Right.
When you think about those poor children now, they've lost their mother, their father, and this uncle.
Right.
Who was their
and now they live with their
life preserver.
Mm-hmm.
And now where are they living?
Their grandparents. Yeah. So they still live at their same home, but it seems
been very traumatic. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so as you say, the jurors were very sensitive to that.
Yeah, they were laser focused on the kids, eyes on the kids. I didn't see a lot of note taking during the kids' testimony.
Right.
And there's been a lot of controversy around the court about whether or not it was a good idea to call the kids. The defense attorney, David Yannetti, actually said on cross-examination to the nephew, he said, "I am so sorry you were made to come here today." And the judge had that stricken from the record immediately. She said, "You can talk to the jury in closing arguments."
That's about that? Right.
We talked to him on the way out of court and said, "Why'd you say that?" And he said, "Because I feel that that's true. Those poor kids had to come here today and testify to this alleged failing relationship just because the Commonwealth couldn't get its adult witnesses to that point." And he said that was not worth it putting those kids on the stand.
Yeah.
I speak to one of our legal analysts who says, kids are called as witnesses in trials all the time.
All the time. Yeah.
It's awkward and it's uncomfortable, but it happens.
He got his point across to the jury, even though it was stricken later. So in the one day of testimony this week, it was very procedural.
Very. So
and what did it
first half of the day we got through the rest of Brian Higgins and the kids. Then it was expert territory.
Right.
Emergency room doctor who treated John O'Keefe, pathologist who took blood samples from Karen and tested them for alcohol levels.
Which her alcohol level by 9 a.m. the next day was still significant.
Yes. So this was, I have to be honest, the testimony, and you can watch back on the stream, it wasn't super direct. Like it took a lot of questions to get to, okay, so what was her alcohol level? And so the jurors were taking a lot of notes during this point. The pathologist testified that it was 93, and I forget what the measurement was, but basically if you did the translation, that would be a 0.093 at 9 a.m. that day. Right. And so remember 0.08 is the legal limit. Then somebody from the Massachusetts State Crime Lab testified, and he actually did what they called like retroactive testing. So using various information, he could do the math for what her blood alcohol level would have been in the middle of the night. And his calculation, I'm looking right in here. Yeah. I'm just trying to find it in my notes, but it was well above the legal limit.
Okay.
Yeah. So that
I did notice the emergency room doctor, they asked him a lot about the fact that he had no injuries, no broken bones, nothing below his chest, right? It was just the head injuries?
So that was on cross-examination. So I did just find this, that he testified that based on their math, her blood alcohol level that night would have been between 0.135 and 0.292.
Okay.
So the emergency room doctor, what he said was, listen, that's not something we do. When somebody comes in, John O'Keefe's body temperature was 80 degrees. He had trauma to his head and his heart wasn't working, and his neurology tests were like the lowest level they could have been. So when they're in the position, when they're working on resuscitation, they are not checking for injuries.
Right.
He said he happened to notice what he called surface level abrasions on John's right arm.
They were just trying to keep him alive.
Exactly. They were just trying to keep him alive. They weren't checking for broken bones. So it'll be interesting to hear more about that whenever the medical examiner testifies.
Okay, great. And let's talk about what we anticipate will be coming, medical examiners coming up. Who else might be coming up?
So we assume the state troopers who were the lead investigators on this case,
Right.
Yuri Buchanan and Michael Proctor.
Proctor. That's a big issue.
Right, exactly. Michael Proctor is the person who the defense has pinned kind of at the center of this conflict of interest and a bad investigation. But at the same time, he is the lead investigator on this case. And so we have not received any information that he would not testify. The defense has said if he doesn't testify for the prosecution, they'll call him. We expect to hear from him at some point, and we've now reached a point in this trial where we've heard from all of the witnesses and friends and family members who were with John and Karen in these final moments.
So that's done.
We're out of people. We're out of lay people. It has to be the experts now. It has to be the investigators now. And so the prosecutors nor the defense attorneys would tell me on Tuesday who's next on the list. So we don't know officially, but really the only people left are medical examiner and investigators as far as categories goes.
For the rest, was there a reason why only one day this week? Just curious.
So we don't know. I did ask one of our legal analysts about this. She says, the judge has a full docket. She has other cases to take care of as well. So she's kind of navigating around that. We know Alan Jackson, the attorney from California, was not here this week. He had a family commitment in California. So that could have played a factor. But we're wondering, when are we going to get back to full time? I mean, next week is only 3 days again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And now we're into June and it's getting to be summertime where people start having vacations. They're going to have a lot of interruptions if they don't wrap this up, which was why the judge 2-3 weeks ago was saying, you have got to get this moving faster.
Exactly.
All right. Any other last thoughts for this week, Kristina Rex?
I just think it's going to be really interesting to see if we see those state troopers next week on the stand.
Yeah, that is what everybody is watching for. All right. WBZ reporter Kristina Rex. Excellent as always. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thanks.